Hello. In the next classes, we will address the patterns that are described in the Martin Fowler's book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. So, the main idea here is that basically, for instance, in your project, the type of application you are developing, we already describe it as a applicational architecture, which is the information system. And so a large amount of applications that exist actually fit into this concept of an information system, and they follow very similar rules. Okay, and but nevertheless, there are variations on how you're gonna implement these systems because you can follow different design strategies. And in the next classes, we'll address the different design strategies. So this book basically describes the patterns and the possible combinations that you can use in order to develop these type of systems. They use a catalog of patterns, okay, that will where we'll discuss each one of that describes each one of the patterns. Okay, so but for probably the first thing is try to understand what is an enterprise application. Okay, and basically an enterprise application is an application where you have persistent data. Okay, you have a large amount of data in the sense that the system is data centered. Okay, so usually it's a repository where you have persistent data and the applications interact, or different applications interact on it. So you following a concurrent access. So we have concurrent access. So you need to manage transactions. You need to manage the concurrent access on top of this data. And another thing is that you can have a large number of user interfaces, different user interfaces. So you may provide for the same business logic, for the same data, for the same logic around the data. You may provide different types of interfaces, for instance, for on a browser or an application, or even interfaces for other applications that are going to interact with this with our application. So another thing is application integration. So at the end, we'll have several applications interact that are remotely. Okay, so and the last characteristic is that it contains complex domain logic, and the logic is in the sense that it's so complex that it has so many if then else, so it has so many business rules, and these business rules keep changing, that sometimes is hard to maintain this code, because basically you keep changing the code because you need to introduce new business rules. For instance, you have a bank account, and then you have a rule that you just define that you can have points if you do some kind of some type of operations, and then you just add to the bank account the concept of credit card, and you change the way you give the points. All these things keeps occurring and changing. Okay, so how can you design these systems? You have already done it. For instance, in the database course, probably what you have done, you have probably managed these in such very close to the data. So you have the data, and basically you have a stored procedures, and the stored procedures to implement this business logic. Though it's one of the ways to do it, but there are several combinations, and we are going to discuss it in the looking at it from a layered point of view. So, which layers do we have? Actually, we have the domain logic layer, where basically you change the data, you implement operations on top of the data, okay, and basically is where you have the most complex part of your of the behavior. And then on top of it, you have a services layer that usually is like a facade that basically provides a more strict interface to this domain logic, because in this domain logic usually you have a lot of classes that basically follow an object-oriented point approach, where these classes communicate, and then you have the intelligence of the business is split by different classes according to high cohesion and low coupling. But to the outside, you want to basically to present a facade that provides just a set of services. So, and usually you have the business logic around this, and then you have a presentation logic. In this presentation logic, you just deal with the part where you provide an interface, okay? And this interface actually can be different type of interfaces. So the advantage of having a layer here that works on top of services is that you can have different types of presentation logic. So you can have a presentation logic for the web, another for Android. So you can have different elements in these layers, or different layers, different presentation layers. And then below the domain logic, you have the data access layer that basically deals with the mapping between the, usually here you follow an object-oriented model, and you deal with the mapping with the transaction manager, okay, where usually the relational database, but could be other type of database, but here you try to isolate the access to it. And we have already seen this in terms of the GPA, okay. And then another thing is that you may interact with other remote services, and so you need to have a remote access. And this can be a bit similar as what you see, for instance, in your front end, when the front end talks with the back end, so you have a remote access to the back end. And in the back end, you have remote services. So these remote services is a kind of service you can provide here. Okay, good. So if you look at it, it follows, it allows to implement, look, persistent data, it's around there. Then you have large amount of data. Yes, you can have databases there with a lot of information. Then you have concurrent access. Yes, you need to deal with transactions. Usually you define transactional contexts here, the way you have defined it in our services. Then you have large amount of user interfaces. Yes, you can have different implementations of these presentation logic, so different presentation logic layers according to what is the target, okay? And you have also application integration. Well, application integration is done through this remote access interface, so you integrate different applications. And complex domain logic, well, you have the domain logic there, okay? So, but the point here is that you can implement these in different ways. We are going to see some of them using these patterns, okay? So in the next classes, we'll address the different patterns here, okay? Good.